All right, so I have a question for the two of you. Given everything we've talked about today, just kind of panning back, what made you want to do a Versado X on influence in the first place?
Yeah, so the genesis of this Versado X, it's actually kind of ironic. I don't think either of us, using air quotes, wanted to do a Versado X on this. I was more than happy to, and hopefully you're understanding that we're both very passionate about the topic.
Yes,
But
we are.
we were voluntold about this topic. Somewhere along the way, I must have made mention of wanting to do it. But in all seriousness, it is a topic that, again, I'm junior in my career and navigating some really experienced people. And in all the relationships I've touched, I think it's one of those skills or ideas or philosophies, whatever influence you want to define it as, is one of those things that has made me most successful in my own way. And I've really appreciated watching others navigate that very well. And so from a millennials perspective, learning to understand it a bit more, how to navigate it, how to be empathetic to it, those types of things make the topic really interesting to me. And I think, you could blow that out to society and all of our different struggles as a society at the moment, like relating to each other a bit better and doing that authentically, I think is just a good thing to ground ourselves in, no matter what the idea is. So that's my thoughts. But
Erik, you're such an old soul. I mean, there's 25 years between us, I think. And it's something that
no
it took
way.
me a little bit longer to actually see and understand that I do have some kind of innate skills in this area. It's not just because I'm older, but it's also, I think some people are just more natural that way. But I do think also just being in this business for a while and being in advertising, which is more of a salesy kind of marketing kind of business, you can learn how to do it well. And I think that there are definitely strategies and ways of being and ways of relating to people that you can work on and get better at. I think for you as well, it comes kind of naturally, but we also work with a lot of people with different personalities and from different walks of life and different experiences. And you can coach people how to bring out those aspects of themselves, that can really influence others in
Yeah.
their own way.
I totally agree. And I actually really enjoy too, and I appreciate the compliments. Whether or not I agree with them entirely is a different thing. But I enjoy the challenge of trying to help others who struggle with the idea of influence or struggle with the idea of expressing themselves clearly or relating or empathetically. I like trying to help guide people along that challenge and leading their thoughts into a cohesive place, because I'll even take my mom. I'll think about her, but she's a person who always I struggle with my words or how to say something. And I enjoy hearing things from her that, yeah, maybe they're jumbled, but clearly I can understand them enough to help her piece it together for herself, which builds her confidence, I hope, and makes her kind of learn that, yeah, I actually do have influence and I am able to express myself. Maybe not the first time, but through conversation, it all comes together. And, nobody's perfect at this thing anyway. So,
Right.
Yeah.
So, as you guys planned for the Versado X and as you planned for the podcast and, a million emails and conversations back and forth, what was the most interesting, and I will leave it with thing, could be fact, could be fiction, could be just whatever, that you learned about influence? What was the most interesting thing that you uncovered as you were planning?
Mm. Do you want me to go, Nancy?
Yes, please.
The short answer is the true etymology of the word, that it came from celestial fluid, and there was this concept of influence well before we could define it as we would know as a modern definition. Should probably give our ancestors more credit since they're the backbone of everything we know now, right? More or less. But that to me was kind of mind blowing, that it actually did come from this higher being and power, and there wasn't actually a thing that prompted influence. It was just a belief, which I think is really cool. That, and of course, I find the fMRI stuff interesting and just genuinely nerdy, but I think the root of the word, or its origins, was really interesting to me.
And to me, I focus less on the science of it and more on how I see this playing out in our everyday lives. The more we talked about it and thought through what we wanted to kind of verbalize about it, I just kept thinking about people that we work with and how it's worked and how it hasn't worked so well, and how we've how each person's personality has impacted the way that they're influential. So it's just kind of fun to think through, to put into action what we've been thinking through as far as how we all use influence and influence each other.
No, that's great. So, everything that you learned, would you say any of that influenced you in any way? All that you learned about influence, did it change the way that you view the topic of influence? Does that make sense? Take your silence as a no.
No, it makes total sense.
That quickly.
I was like, I'm going to let her sweat this out. She doesn't know if we actually understood it or if we're just thinking.
Staring into space.
Yeah. Well, clearly you haven't been listening on some of our skills on how to build influence, because haven't been able to answer that question. No, I don't know if it did or not, which is probably the irony of influence, right?
Right. Yeah,
maybe it has,
totally.
and I just don't know what that is yet.
Yeah.
I do think it's one of those things. Nancy made a comment previously, or as we were going through this, that she verbalized, I can't even remember what the thing was, but the idea was she had made a comment about the way she leads her job, and I know what it was. It was about how we are not a seat of authority with our clients, yet we are here to kind of guide them and provide authority in a way, or provide influence. And it's a concept that I innately understood, but had never verbalized, and it makes you think about things differently. So I think that idea was what I took away from this the most. There was probably things about influence that you kind of understand, you've never actually articulated or had to sit down and really think about. But as you read about things or you experience them or have conversations with people about them, you start to go, oh, wow, like I actually am being influenced by this, or it's helping define my concepts of influence more than I give it credit for. So if that answers your question at all, and you can take as much time to let me know if I actually answered or not.
Thank you. Awkward sweat for a minute. All right.
And
Nancy, what do you think?
yeah, I mean, I can say that, as we're talking through this, I was kind of digging into research and looking into different ways that we're influenced and what affects how we're influenced. And you can look at all these different areas, like your age or your gender or your different experience, or like your personality profile. Does that help you understand somebody and how they influence others and how they're influenced? We've done the DISC profile and strength finders here, and it helps you kind of like understand someone better. But the net for me was, even after looking at all those stereotypes, we had some really lively conversations about millennials and Gen Xers, and we can talk about some of those examples. It was really fun. But what it comes right down to is everybody's so individual. You can't pin them down by how old they are, or, if they grew up in California versus New York, or, what their work experience has been. You have to get to know them. You can't stereotype people based on any one thing. It's about actively listening and getting to know someone and finding that common ground, like we talked about. So to me, it just really brought that home.
Oh, totally. So, okay, you can't stereotype people.
But it's fun to try, isn't it?
No, it is totally fun to try. And so I'm gonna ask my next question is, would you say, or did you find any common theme when it relates to people of influence, that they would be more likely to be introverted or extroverted?
I think there's different ways to be influential.
Okay.
Because I consider myself pretty introverted, but I feel like I have more meaningful conversations,
Right.
And I'm more intentional about them. Maybe I'm not saying I'm expert at them, and I totally put my foot in my mouth often, but I think there's just different ways to exert your influence in a more quiet way versus in a more gregarious way. Like I would say Erik is a little bit more extroverted and gregarious, and I can't even speak to exactly his influence, but I think there's different ways to be influential by being yourself.
That's fair. Yeah. What do you think, Erik?
No, I wholeheartedly agree. And it's funny you say that too, because I was thinking about myself in answering this question. Like, how do I do it? If I do it well at all, right? Like, I'm sure there's instances I have. There's sometimes I've fallen flat. But as much as I think my natural tendency would be to be more gregarious or like extroverted in how I bring it to life, and downplayed, be a little self-deprecating, bring some humility to the conversation. But I definitely can think of times where I've kind of that juxtaposition of like, what does somebody want to hear from me, or like, who am I trying to influence and how do they need to hear it? I think it's exactly some of the things you were alluding to, Nancy. So I've put my own ego aside, or my own bias to how I'd want to be influenced, and then tailor it to them. Again, not trying to manipulate, not trying to be disingenuous in doing that, but you have to recognize that, like, if somebody's very introverted and I'm trying to influence them and I can be more extroverted, that's going to turn them off. And so, like, my message is lost, even if they respect me or wanted to listen. If I'm not making it palatable for them, what's the point in paying attention?
You have to be where they are and the way that they hear things well.
It's like feedback in that way, right?
Adapt
you
to
have
that.
You have to be open to feedback as much as you need to be ready to deliver it, like, appropriately.
You have to adjust your style to what their tendencies are.
Absolutely. So yeah, I would totally agree with Nancy's comment and add nothing to that, basically, in my answer.
There's a lot of words to add nothing.
To add nothing.
Okay.
It goes back to my extroversion, apparently. Love hearing my own voice.
No, that was great.
I mean, I can give you an example of like how you need to kind of adjust your style to someone else and bring it back to someone on our team, because that to me is like the most fun part of all this. Let's talk about Tiffany, right? She's like squarely in that D category. She's all about like taking action and getting immediate results and challenging others to be that way. So when you're dealing with someone like Tiffany or a client that's just super direct, it's going to be way more effective to be direct back and to the point and not waste time. But, still sprinkle in some good humor because she's one of the funniest people I know.
Oh, absolutely makes sense.
Do I want to talk about anybody else while we're at it?
I was just thinking that.
I mean, it takes me back to that conversation where we're talking about generations, and I started talking about from my perspective, and I really tried to tone it down, of what the stereotypes of millennials are. And this is through lots of research, mind you. This was lots of websites. I didn't make it up. I just kind of compiled it. And I started reading, what some of the aspects are of a typical millennial. Curtis was having none of it.
I don't know that he was offended, but he was definitely on the slow your roll category.
Yes.
He's like, oh, please tell me more about myself. Like, tell me what you know about me, essentially.
Yeah, that was really fun.
Yeah.
He exerted his influence in his own millennial way.
There you go. I was going to say, in many ways, it was poetic.
Yes.
Like, exactly how he tried to interject was not to make you feel as though your thoughts were invalid.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
But yeah, he was definitely going to temper that with his own version of reality, which is a whole nother beast to what can complicate influence if we want to go down that rabbit hole. But, we all have different opinions. It's what makes the world go round. And especially like disc profiles, we all have different, basal levels of how we operate and how we think and what makes us comfortable. And so, like, influence being an energy, we all have our own energies. So having to tailor influence in that kind of weird conceptual way is just makes it that much more complicated, but that much more rewarding.
But also makes it fun, right?
Exactly.
To kind of figure out where somebody is.
Totally.
What makes them tick and how you can just kind of interact with them in a really fun or productive or, way that's needed. It's just kind of fun to figure it out.
Yeah,
I know you did.
It makes us mild sociopaths, but with good intention. Like, that's how I like to think about it, at least. That's why I drink my coffee black. But no, I totally agree. It's rewarding to put your own ego aside and think about how somebody else needs to hear something because you want to help them be better or to see something differently or again, good intended no matter what the thing is. So I agree. That's a fun way to approach it.
It's also very satisfying when you feel like someone's done that for you, Like me personally, when I feel like someone's listening and trying to understand and speaking to me in my own kind of language and my own place, it's hugely satisfying. So if you can just think about it that way when you're speaking to others.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny too, because so much, I'm a millennial. So hearing Curtis's perspective on his defense of millennials, in many ways I agreed with him. And in so many ways I was like, this is exactly why we get the reputation.
A little defensive, Mr. Millennial?
Yeah. And again, none of his defense was wrong. It's his perception of things, and he's entitled to all of that. And in many ways, he's actually probably more right than my own perceptions of things because Curtis is a genius. But it's funny, when I think about how I've learned how to influence, I have picked that up from people from different generations.
I was going to say, you worked with a lot of people that are older than you, including me. So are there stereotypes that stick for you about other generations and how you influence them?
I do think it's probably the one that's on the tip, the low-hanging fruit, whatever the analogy is. Millennials can be a little bit more sensitive to feedback and things of that nature, or internalize it, take it a bit more personally. That is one thing I've hoped to have learned from older generations who have been around the workforce a bit longer, and that value system of either tradition or just putting the job or the greater good above yourself at times versus always having to make it this kind of internal self-actualization of like, what's the intent, what's the purpose, and just realizing that sometimes the intent and purpose is beyond just you, it's for the greater good. So that is something that I actually have really respected about learning from other generations, specifically in the workforce, but of course to like my own personal life. But I can think of just as many instances where I've appreciated bringing my millennial perspective
Absolutely.
that has been shaped by other generations and then flipping that and sending it back the other direction.
Yes.
My parents as one, other folks, even colleagues and peers like yourself. I hope I've influenced you in some way.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
I think that's the fun part of it too, is like the recognition that I am nothing without the other generations helping shape how I influence, but then also putting my own flavor to that and kind of putting it back the other direction.
Yeah, and I have to say that's something about our environment that's so refreshing, is that we really do kind of respect, the other person, no matter where they come from or what their age is, and we are all influenced by each other at some point in time.
I would agree.
Yeah, you have to be open to it, and we really foster that kind of openness.